And now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ted Johnson, and I am a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice and the director of its fellows program, and a contributing author of the new book, A Return to Normalcy, the 2020 election that almost broke America. The book is available through pre-order from the UVA bookstore and through major online bookstores. This is the last of 3 events surrounding the book, looking back at the 2020 election and ahead to the 2022 midterms and the 2024 presidential election. The center's next event is on Wednesday, April 21st at 4 p.m. His Excellency Lazarus Kambabwe will speak on the relationship between Zambia and the United States, the latest successes and challenges in the country, and the state of civil discourse in Zambia. Information is available on the Center for Politics website, centerforpolitics.org, or just type the name of the event into the search feature in eventbrite.com. Finally, if you would like to support the Center for Politics, you can text civility to 41444 to support this program. Now, I would like to introduce our panel for this evening. Andra Gillespie is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University. Mark Hugo Lopez is Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center. And Natalie Masuoka is Associate Professor of Political Science and Asian American Studies at UCLA. So welcome to each of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So let's jump right in. And even though I don't want to give the impression that we're going to sort of block off every race and ethnicity in the United States in the course of our conversation this evening, I actually want to start in that way and talking about what we saw leading into the 2020 election and what we saw during the election itself for 3 blocks of voters: Black Americans, Asian American and Pacific Islander Americans, and Hispanic Americans. And luckily, I've got the best 3 folks in the country to talk to about those things. So I'd love to start with you, Andra, about Black Americans and what the narrative around Black folks going into the 2020 election was, and then what we saw in the presidential election that was either surprising or pretty much stayed true to form.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. It is great to be back at UVA. I wish I could be there in person. There's a lot of continuity if we look at what voting behavior looks like in the 2020 election cycle. So since 1964, African Americans have been overwhelmingly, and by overwhelmingly, I mean above 85 and usually are in the area of 90% or more Democratic in terms of their voting behavior. That doesn't change this election cycle, despite everything that you might have heard about African American men becoming more Republican in their voting behavior. And it's true, both African American men and women did vote more Republican in this election compared to, say, 2016. But I think we have to put this into context. So one, if we're going to look at election polls and the exit surveys, we have the benefit of having 2. And there actually was an agreement between Edison Matofsky and AP Votecast. So if we average the 2 together, it actually looks kind of more normal. Second, it's important to realize that in a second term re-election potentially of a Republican incumbent, it's not uncommon for them to pick up more votes amongst African-American voters. As our friend and colleague Vince Hutchings at the University of Michigan is always ready to point out, when you have 80% or more of African Americans or 89% of African Americans voting for one candidate, that's as close to unanimity as you're going to get. And so it doesn't mean that this is a monolith. It doesn't mean that people are voting for, the same reasons or voting Democratic for the same reasons. But Blacks are still the undisputed most loyal Democratic voting bloc in the United States. And that's amplified if we look at Black women who are overrepresented in the electorate. I think if there's one thing that I want to take away from this election cycle, in preparation for today, I was looking at my own state's turnout data, which we do have turnout broken down by race and ethnicity. there are still turnout gaps. And when the CPS data comes out, in the next couple of months, I expect that whites still turned out at a higher rate than African Americans across the board, and at higher rates than Asian American and Hispanic voters. So the fact that we're seeing this happen, one, I mean, it's in part a shift of white voters who were uncomfortable with the Trump era voting Democratic. But what this suggests is the capacity for multiracial coalition and the fact that there can be a buffer. The fact that people of color are still more likely to be Democratic and they don't even have to maximize their turnout when joined with liberal white voters to be able to vote Democratic. And so this doesn't guarantee an era of, Democratic wins going forward, but what it does suggest is a level of competitiveness where demographics play not the entire role, but do play a role that must be considered.
Yeah. And can you say something about so regionally, we know Black folks in Detroit voted pretty much like Black folks in Atlanta, 90% for the Democrat. But were there different, and you mentioned this a little bit about the difference between Black men and Black women. So the gender gap among African Americans, was it anything notable happen in this election? Or did that also stay pretty true to form from what we've seen in past presidential elections?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the first time that there's been a gender gap between Black women and men, between Latinas and Latinos in particular. So if we go back and look over presidential election cycles in the last decade, those gender gaps were there. They don't always exist, but it's not uncommon for Black women to be voting more Democratic than their Black male counterparts. And oftentimes, because our survey sample sizes are so small, we're still trying to figure out exactly what's going on there to explain it. But that doesn't negate the fact that, at least 8 out of 10 Black men, voted Democratic. And that is, much closer to 100 than I think what some people are trying to tout. And I know we're going to get to this a little bit later. But, the idea that there's this partisan shift towards the Republican Party amongst Blacks, particularly Black men, is based on really thin evidence that I don't think is there. And I remember sitting as an undergraduate, it was the second year in Paula McLean's class in Cabell Hall at UVA, where Haley Barbour was making the same comments 25 years ago, right? And that didn't materialize. And so I would caution Republicans against looking at that number in the Edison Matovsky poll and looking at the endorsement from Ice Cube or Lil Wayne or anybody as a harbinger of, some type of secular realignment happening, amongst Blacks towards the Republican Party. There's a lot of contrary evidence to suggest that that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. So Natalie Masuoka, same question for you around AAPI voters. What did we expect to see going into 2020? And then what did we learn or what was sort of surprising or confirmation of what we thought we would see in the actual election when it occurred?
In some ways, I think, as Andrea mentioned, we did see a lot of continuity, the continuity for Asian American voters. And I think for one, I will mention that a lot of our data that we have available are Asian American voters. I think, what we know about Pacific Islander voters is still very, very, very weak in terms of evidentiary support. So, I think I'll focus most of my comments on Asian American voters. But Asian Americans are one of the fastest growing racial groups in the United States. And what is that's meant is that it's also one of the fastest growing voting electorates in the United States. And so what was really exciting to see for 2020 is in many ways, a similar pattern that we've seen in 8 and in 16. And we saw in this last election is that the growth has been exponential. I saw a report by APIA Vote that reported it was over 300% of an increase in the total number of Asian American voters that cast their ballot in this past election. And so in that way, Asian American the electorate is, because it is new, it's growing, and it's growing primarily due to immigration, that it is a little bit of a different story in terms of what we're thinking about continuity. So, the continuity part, I think, is the growth. In terms of what this community is really looking like in terms of politics, I think that this is one of the really exciting pictures and I think questions for us in political science, just to understand, where is the Asian American electorate going? Since 8, we've seen a really clear lean towards a Democratic Party. But I think that one of the most important things to talk about when we talk about Asian American voters is the really inherent ethnic or national origin diversity within the population, right? So you have historic, long-standing Japanese and Chinese American communities that have been here since the civil rights movement, right, that have had that kind of history here in the United States. They've seen the movement towards the left, right, joining communities of color in the civil rights movement. But then we also see a lot of new immigrant groups, right, coming in from a much broader array of different national origin, origins. From Southeast Asia, the Philippines, India is now Indian Americans are now the second largest group in the Asian national origin group in the United States, right? And so all of these groups, which are overwhelmingly immigrant, the post 65 immigration wave, they're learning about politics, right? They're new voters. And so the idea of their partisanship, I think, is more of a question. And so we're thinking about to what extent the lean towards the Democratic Party that we've been seeing in the last few elections is really going to be a cemented attachment towards the Democratic Party, right? Or is there some wiggle room in terms of there may be some varying attachment? I think what we've seen already historically is that, for example, Vietnamese Americans, particularly those who have come in as part of and hold anti-communist politics, right, do tend to lean towards the Republican Party. But again, the dynamism here that as we see, one, the transition away from the Vietnam War and also the transition for second generation in the United States to become new voters, right, then we're seeing a trend, a lot of us, I think, are seeing some transition in some of these communities. So I think the dynamism here is really important. And I think, this is a great conversation to be having in terms of what we can think about expecting, in the next few election cycles.
The growth you talked about, is that more, those aren't necessarily new people coming to the country and becoming citizens. There are people already here who are now engaging in engaging in the electoral process. It's sort of a increased voter participation rate of folks who are here and not necessarily an increase in the overall population, or is it some mix of both?
It's probably a mix of both. So one, we had the major wave of Asian immigration came in after 1965. So their second generation children right now are having children. They're part of that life cycle where they're engaging in their civic life, right? They have various different types of interests. And so I think we are seeing that transition of the American-born second generation now becoming much more politically active. But at the same time, over 70% of Asian adults in the United States, so those right above the age of 18, are foreign born, right? So I think we have to account for the fact that a lot of the new voters, the new voting electorate, is part of immigrants becoming citizens, right? And then registering and becoming voters. And so this is a challenging picture for us in terms of thinking about, right, like how is it that we're socializing this new electorate? Because on the one hand, we have this wave of the second generation American born, but then on the other hand, we also have this large new immigrant population that's was socialized from a different country, right, learning about politics. And these are two new electorates, right, with really two different types of experiences here in the United States that we're thinking about mobilizing for campaigns.
Right. So Mark Hugo Lopez, I remember seeing a report from Pew maybe a year or two ago that said the 2020 election would be the first election where Hispanic Americans were the largest non-white part of the electorate for the first time in history. So tell me a little bit about what we thought we would see going into 2020, and then what held true in the actual election, and then what sort of surprised us or confirmed what we thought.
So coming into this election, we were seeing the number of Hispanics eligible to vote, and that's people who are at least 18 years of age and a U.S. citizen, reaching about 31, almost 32 million people. That puts it slightly ahead of the Black American eligible voter population, essentially the same. But what's interesting about this is that we've been seeing over the course of many elections, the number of Latinos who were now eligible to vote. Most of them, by the way, are young people who were born in the US, but who enter adulthood. those numbers were rising by about 3.5 to 4 million every 4 years. So if you think about that, this growth in the number of Latinos who could potentially vote has been rising for some time, and it's been an ongoing story of the Latino vote. But even though there's a large number who are eligible, one of the challenges has always been how many are going to turn out to vote. And coming into this election cycle, that was a big part of the conversation. But interestingly, coming off of 2018, the number of Latinos who voted in 2018 was almost like a presidential year. And if you remember, 2018 as a midterm election was one where many Americans overall turned out to vote, and Latinos were no different in this respect. So there was a lot of excitement that the stage was set for not only a large number eligible to vote, but perhaps a real, truly record turnout that is more than just about demographics, but because people wanted to get involved and to participate. So fast forward to the election, what do we know? Well, we're still waiting for some data from the current population survey to get a sense of, from the Census Bureau, to get a sense of what the estimated number of Hispanic voters is based off of that data. But it looks like it'll be about 16 million, which would make this, of course, a record, but also on par in some ways with what we've seen for the general public, that is with a large surge of turnout overall. So we'll see what we finally get in terms of a voter turnout rate, but it remains to be seen how Latinos will have done. The other big story, though, about the Latino vote going into the election was how Latinos were feeling in the United States. How do they feel about their place in the country in light of a Trump administration? Mm-hmm. And a lot of the conversation around Latinos, particularly from the Trump administration and President Trump himself, was a conversation that revolved around the way immigrants are portrayed, particularly Mexican immigrants, as criminals and rapists, and that resonated with a lot of people in the electorate. But at the same time, Trump also talked a lot about Venezuela, about Cuba, and about opposing the leaders in those countries, and that had some appeal to those in South Florida, for example. So going into this election, there was a lot of interest that Latinos were going to come out and support Joe Biden in strong numbers. But the results of the election were interesting. Nationally, the exit polls say Joe Biden won about 2/3 of the Latino vote. That's about on par with recent Democratic presidential candidates. But there were some noticeable places, some noticeable counties where the support for Donald Trump in 2020 compared with 2016 was up. And many of these counties are largely Hispanic counties. So first, South Florida, Miami-Dade. Joe Biden won Miami-Dade as a county with about 58% of the vote. However, that was below what Hillary Clinton had won in 2016. And a lot of the shifts seem to have come from particularly Cuban communities, Venezuelan communities, Colombian communities, essentially a large part of South Florida. And then you look at South Texas. It looks like along the US-Mexico border, there was a shift towards Trump among counties where frankly, the majority of the population, almost all the population, is Hispanic. And so there too, there were some questions about why that happened there. Further looking at a lot of the data around the country showed that there were some shifts in other places around the country as well. Every place from Philadelphia to Chicago to Los Angeles to even San Francisco. Now, I'm not talking about huge shifts, but a noticeable trend, it seems, across the country among Latino voters, leaning more towards Donald Trump. But why? Well, the story can't be explained alone by Cuban and Venezuelan voters supporting Donald Trump more in 2020 than in 2016. There's just not enough of those voters. But if you look at other places, it seems to be a combination of stories, a combination of a growing gender gap, a gap that had been emerging over the last 10, 15 years among Latino voters as well. And it seems to have gotten perhaps to its biggest in this last election, with a majority of Hispanic men saying they were going to support Joe Biden going into the election, but that their support was, and the gap between them and Hispanic women had grown, and their support was, well, over 50%, wasn't quite what it had been, say, with Obama back in 2008, for example. Mm-hmm. And you also see that third generation Hispanics maybe have leaned more towards the Republican Party, particularly Mexican Americans in the Southwest, than had been the case in the past. But it's always just a little bit here and a little bit there, with maybe the one exception being South Florida, which has long been a place where Republican presidential candidates have tended to do well. The pandemic, though, had a big impact on Latinos, and it had two impacts. Had an economic impact and a health impact, I should say. That's two. But a third one is the election as well, which is that the election was in many ways different in the way it was organized. So many people could vote in different ways. And that likely helped many Latino voters get out to vote in a way that wasn't the case before. And it's interesting that when we did a survey post-election, about 75% of Latino adults tell us that they'd been reached out to by the campaigns. That seems to be up from in the past. So there was interest in reaching out to Latinos, which is also another change. There's much more to talk about, but those are some of the things that we were seeing in terms of this election cycle.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I remember, I think maybe it was in the Republicans' autopsy report, and I guess that was 2012, 2013-ish. And or even Michael Steele being named as the Republican national chairman after Obama won in 2008. But there's always been this sense that either Republicans figure out how to win more voters of color, or the party has no shot. But I remember looking at some of the exit polling, and it's basically showed that 75% of the folks that voted in the 2020 election, highest turnout election in 120 years, were white. And 25% were voters of color. So even as voting eligible, when we talk about voting eligible numbers, I think voters of color were 1 in 3 in the country. When it came to voter participation, only 1 in 4 voters were of color made up the electorate. And so this helps explain how a super high turnout election was really decided by about 40,000 votes or so across 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and I guess Wisconsin, Michigan, one of those 2. So the Republican Party kind of has a future without broadening its tent if the voter participation rates remain kind of as is and don't mimic the voting eligible composition of the electorate. So the question is to all of you, it's kind of broad, but what does the future of electoral appeals for both parties look like if the looming demographic change is coming much slower than than the reporting would suggest otherwise? Are there strategies the parties need to adopt sooner rather than later? Are there micro-targeting strategies around specific folks based on their nation of origin or their age or where they live in the country that can sort of stave off the doom for the one party that's very homogenous in favor of the other that is quite diverse? Maybe I'll start with Andra here.
So that's a difficult question because I think it has moral and ethical implications. And so what we see Donald Trump has done in the last 5 years is appeal to fear. And so he basically is operating under the 2050 is here type of paradigm and telling people that they need to be afraid of it, as opposed to helping people embrace diversity and recognize that there's strengths there. So if we look at the language and the tenor and tone of his language, it's scapegoating immigrants. It is calling African Americans stupid and saying that they should be Republicans. It is, tapping into sort of base fears about loss of social dominance and racial resentment, right? All of these things are normatively problematic. And that's not something that I would want to do. And I would argue that in the long term, it's actually pretty unsustainable because, eventually the United States is going to be majority minority. And eventually you can't rely on populations being apathetic or not having enough citizens in order to be able to cast ballots. Micro-targeting is great. I want to focus the micro-targeting one in ways that actually, involves leadership. And instead of sort of like playing to people's base fears and lying and spreading misinformation, what I would want to do is try to sort of help people understand and appreciate that there's strength in our diversity so that people aren't afraid. And so that we can sort of take a lot of the sort of isms out of this and we can have legitimate policy debates. That's a tall order. And there's a whole bunch that we could say about polarization that, doesn't have to do with race, even though it does there. And so I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But the other part of it that's important is the parties have to reach out to voters. And one of the lessons of this cycle is, I think that there's some things about COVID that hampered Democratic efforts in reaching out to voters of color that maybe depressed voter turnout. But But the big issue is that if you contact voters, it doesn't matter what color they are, they're more likely to show up to vote. And so the big lesson of this is stop making assumptions about, oh, Blacks are Democrats, so therefore Republicans don't need to bother to campaign in those communities, and Democrats don't need to bother and campaign in those communities because you've got that vote on lockdown. And you shouldn't make assumptions about Asian American and Hispanic voters not being citizens and thus not worthy of campaign attention. If you campaign in communities and ask for your vote, one, there's a turnout impact that we can trace. And then there's likely one to be a trust dividend. And like, this is an important thing to do substantively, to not exploit and take communities for granted and ignore their issues. That's really important.
Yeah, Natalie, does it look like for Asian American voters that they're trending away or trending into the Democratic Party, and there's not much that can be done to stem the tide, or are places like California, are they just beyond reach for anyone but Democrats? Are there pockets in California, for example, where Republicans can win Asian American voters and send folks to the House? Or how does the demographic trends reflect on strategies in appealing to Asian American voters?
Yeah, California is a really interesting state because it actually really does address your question, which is, kind of to what extent demography is destiny. So California has no racial majority on the population level, right? But white voters actually make up the majority of the voters, right? So I think in that way, we are still continuing to see how at an institutional level that white voters still tend to hold a lot of the voting power, regardless of what the demography of any given area actually looks like. I think that said, what we're seeing, just as this state is kind of a case study here for demography. That said, we are seeing one of the amazing things is that with large communities of color is that there is processes in place and strategies in place of creating pipelines, right, for leaders of color, different community organizations, various different strategies being put in place, which is allowing, even if voters of color don't make up the majority of the electorate in the United States, in California, they still actually hold a lot of political power, particularly if they are able and do choose to act as a collective bloc. I think what we're seeing in, for California is that, Asian American voters are very, their politics seems to be really influenced by context. I've been doing some analysis about variation across the state, and Asian American voters, for example, voted much more progressively on our statewide ballot initiatives. We had quite a wide variety on criminal justice, the gig economy, affirmative action. And you saw, interestingly, for example, in the Bay Area, that Asian American voters were actually very progressive. They had very solidly progressive opinions and voting preferences. But then when you start looking at Southern California, it was actually much more evenly distributed between progressive positions and you can say kind of non-progressive positions on these statewide ballots. So I think, in that way, we're seeing, especially kind of going back to my original comment about, being new voters, is that the types of surrounding politics, right, of Asian American communities is in many ways part of that influential, these really influential factors that are socializing these communities into politics. Orange County, for example, there was, we looked at it as this area that historically was Republican, right? It was historically kind of a white flight suburban area in Southern California. It flipped blue, right, during the kind of Obama 08 to 16 era. But then here in 2020, we saw it go back, having a really strong Republican presence, right? So showing here how some of these, with Asian American voters also voting, in many ways assisting some of these efforts for the Republican Party. So we can see here how dynamic, I think, that if there really are some genuine attempts, and in Orange County, there were actually Asian American candidates running as Republicans on the ballots, right? Running actually de-racialized, so not kind of these, these campaigns that were really trying to mobilize white anxieties, right? But Republican candidates of color who are running these more moderate campaigns addressing issues that were of interest, right, to Asian Americans. And we saw, right, that for example, like Orange County being a case study, is that there was strong, relatively strong support with those candidates actually being able to win office. Right. And so in that way, I think, we can see how it is possible. But if the Republican Party continues, right, to rely on these messages where they're really targeting the white voter, that in that way, it is not possible. So I think we got to think about too, it's not necessarily just, like some kind of, kind of natural organic process that's going to happen. I mean, I think that you have to kind of think about what is the Republican Party going to do, right? Because it's not necessarily just, something fundamental. And we can see, especially candidates of color that are Republican, they are able to actually generate support from their own communities.
Yeah. Yeah. So Mark, well, I think one of the surprises, maybe for most of the country, was Arizona. And a lot of talk, as you mentioned, about like Cuban Americans, Venezuelan Americans in South Florida helping Trump carry the state that folks thought were kind of competitive. I think even the polling was showing Biden maybe had a shot at winning Florida. Arizona seems to me caught a lot of the country by surprise. And I'm curious how much Hispanic voters led that surprise result in Arizona, and whether or not that defied what the caricature of Hispanic American voters has been in the country, specifically under a Trump administration or during the Trump administration.
It's a great question, because I think that it really shows how both diverse the population is. And notice, by the way, that I'm using population as opposed to community, because the Hispanic or Latino population in this country, it comes from many different origins, has many different experiences, many different backgrounds, and lives in many different parts of the country. And the politics can be very different in different places. But as you noted, South Florida, we saw this move towards Trump. Arizona was kind of in the opposite direction. We usually think about Latinos in Arizona as being more conservative, but Arizona has also changed as a state as people have moved from California, Latinos and non-Latinos alike. And so the state's demographics have shifted over the years. The same thing is true of Texas. Even though we talked earlier about Texas and the border region having this sort of shift towards Trump, generally speaking, the state was one that seemed to be perhaps even competitive in some ways, at least some pre-election polling seemed to show. So the story of the Latino vote, I think, is one of change, and it's one of diversity. And in fact, I should have said the story of Latino voters, not the Latino vote, because there's no single vote. It's a group of people who are loosely tied together by this pan-ethnic term, but it's a diverse population and a diverse group of voters who vary in their views and politics around the country. I would also say there's one other interesting thing about the Latino population that is worth noting, which is that immigration has slowed. As Natalie said earlier, the largest new immigrant arrivals are from Asia, no longer Latin America, and China and India are the largest sources of new immigrants today, no longer Mexico. But we've now had over a decade of slow immigration from Latin America, despite even the recent surge from Central America, by the way. In comparison, it's relatively small compared to previous waves, except maybe in the last month or two. But what's interesting here is that that means that you're starting to see a more settled population in the country. The US-born children of immigrant parents are coming of age, but there's also a growing number of US-born Latinos of US-born parents, both of whom may not be Hispanic, so intermarriage rates are high as well. I don't know if the country will be in this majority-minority position 50, 60 years from now if Latinos no longer identify in the future as Latino because of intermarriage. And our surveys have shown that there's a growing number of people who say they have Hispanic ancestry, about 5 million adults, for example, but do not call themselves Hispanic or Latino. They don't self-identify as part of the group. So what will the demographics of the country be? I don't know. But I do also want to say that the right candidates can really do well among the Latino vote, whether they're Republican or they're Democrat, and among Latino voters.
Right.
And if they're Republican or if they're Democrat, look at how well George Bush did in 2004. He won about 40% plus of Latino voters' support. And if you take a look at Obama, how well he did among Latinos, he won almost 81, 82% of Hispanic voters vote in 2008 and 2012. Both of those say to me that the candidate, a good candidate, no matter which party, can win a significant share of the vote of Latino voters. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into this next question about descriptive representation and how important it is to each of these voting blocks and the disaggregated portions of these voting blocks that they run candidates of the same race, of the same ethnicity, of the same national origin. I was looking at some numbers the other day that says the previous Congress on the Republican side of the aisle, more than 95% of their elected officials in the House and the Senate combined were white, men and women, but white. And on the Democratic side, I think just over a third were people of color. And so the bench is very deep on one side when it comes to descriptive representation to diverse communities and very thin on the other. And yet, if you look at the Tea Party movement, for example, a lot of people of color swept into the Republican Party across the country. Bobby Jindal, Alan West, Tim Scott, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Mia Love. I mean, so many. And so what does descriptive representation look like? And specifically, how does it influence the voting behavior of these different communities, particularly if it's in the Republican Party, where perhaps there's some policy alignment, but the visual of someone, a descriptive representative, may cause some folks to shift their voting choices. And this is sort of open to the group, so whoever wants to jump in here can.
Well, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, when you listed all of the Republicans of color who have risen to prominence in the last decade or so, you can still count them on your hands, and I think it's important to point that out. As much as they are interesting and fascinating, and as much as I study them and think about this question, my insides is still really, really small, and that does limit sometimes, what I can say, knowing that, well, this just gives me more time to think and write about that later. Descriptive representation is important because it confers legitimacy on a system. If our Congress was all white men today, there'd be a lot of people who would be upset and would think that there was something wrong with the system. And they would think that their voices weren't heard, even if people were passing legislation that they liked. And so there's an important legitimacy component, but there are other things that we have to think about. So, I think about the work of one of Natalie's colleagues, Matt Barreto and Gary Segura at UCLA. And this is actually borne out not just amongst Latinos, but also amongst African American and Asian American voters. When people are represented by folks who look like them, they tend to vote more. So it's really important for us to recognize the effects. It's not uniformly across the case. There's certainly work that's been done that suggests that sort of like over time, the turnout bump goes down, particularly after you get represented by people for a long period of time. But we can't ignore sort of how this is actually really helpful for voter turnout. We also can't ignore the ways that these representatives actually behave differently once they're in office. So whether it is, putting your district office kind of, in communities of color so people can actually get to it. As our friend Christian Gross has pointed out, or as our friend Mike Menta has pointed out, the fact that members of Congress who are of color are more likely to testify before other congressional committees that they're not a part of to highlight issues. There is a certain access and certain knowledge that people bring out of their lived experience that helps make them better legislators. And we can also point to the fact, I can point specifically amongst African-American voters, that African-Americans who are represented by other African-Americans give their member of Congress higher approval ratings. So there are lots of reasons to do that. Now, I mean, this isn't an argument for essentialism. This does not mean that any person of color can represent somebody else of color. Things like party matter. So we're not seeing people jump ship to go vote for somebody else because they happen to share a racial or ethnic identity. If they're of a different party, right, there are differences there. My graduate student and there's some of this work and some of his that he's doing independently. Kevin Sparrow has just done this really fascinating project that looks at, well, what kinds of, Black candidates in particular appeal to Black voters, particularly when they're running against whites. And what he finds is that, there isn't a whole lot of ideological difference in ideological preference once it's very clear that somebody is a Democrat. If we're in our sample was African-American Democrats there. But if this Black Democrat portrays himself as too conservative, right? People are kind of discerning there, and they're like, yeah, you know what? I don't think that I'm down with that necessarily. And there's also the difference that we have to keep in mind that I think we'll probably get to this a little bit later when we start talking about polarization. But conservatism looks different, even amongst communities of color. And so I think we think that all conservatives of color look like Trump Republicans now. That's actually not true. That also explains why so many conservatives of color are still Democrats, right? Because race actually still matters. And if we didn't believe this today, to see Republican Asian American congresswomen come out and speak out against racism in the wake of the Atlanta shooting and anti-Asian violence, and actually to also condemn some of their other colleagues who were running for office for saying, yeah, you can't race bait, or you can't debate within ethnic communities within the Asian diaspora, right, is also really important. That's something that looks different, and we've got to acknowledge that and understand that.
Yeah, Natalie, Mark, how does descriptive representation move different electorates, or does it? Yeah.
You want to go first, Mark?
Sorry, Natalie. I wanted to say thank you. So it's a very interesting question. And a few years ago at the center, we asked the Latino population, who's the nation's most prominent Latino leader, and most said that they couldn't name somebody. But one of the things that you hear a lot of folks talk about is we need another Cesar Chavez to represent the issues and interests of the nation's Hispanic population. Now, I'm not sure how well or how effective somebody like that might be. It's not clear that somebody of a Mexican-American origin will appeal to somebody of Dominican origin, for example. And so I think that when we talk about this, just because somebody is Latino doesn't necessarily mean that that candidate is going to appeal to all of the wide range of diversity within the nation's Latino population. But it is notable that we're seeing a growing number of Latinos elected to political office, appointed to political office. The numbers have doubled at least since 2000 in terms of the number of people, Latinos and Latinas, who are holding public office in some way or another. And that suggests a growing diversity in the backgrounds of folks representing their local communities and places. So I think it's an interesting question, but it's one that I think we need to be sensitive to the diversity of the population and what that means in terms of origins, experiences, how far from the immigrant experience somebody is, and also to not fall into the trap of saying just because somebody is Latino and speaks Spanish, that means that they're going to be the best representative for Latinos.
That's right, right.
I think a lot of what Mark had just said, in many ways applies to Asian American voters. I think maybe one additional thing I would add on top of what are already, I think, been some really good points made, is that for Asian American elected officials, they have this unusual, in some ways, challenge of typically being an elected official over a district that is not necessarily populated by their own group, right? So Asian Americans are actually really small, numerically, it's a small population. Not to say that there aren't Asian American representatives that are governing districts that are majority Asian American, but that is actually a few number in size, and really only primarily at the local level. And so one of the things I think that's been really interesting about Asian American representation, and this kind of floods into Mark's point about, for Asian Americans kind of looking at people and to what extent that they're seeing them as representing their own communities, is that, for Asian American elected officials, they've really had to do kind of more of these de-racialized campaigns, right? They've had to really be more universalistic. They can't necessarily be specific, target Asian specific types of issues, because they've really had to generate interest and support, right, from a much more diverse electorate and an electorate that does not look like them. And so I think in that way, it's really challenging for us to measure Asian American attitudes about their representatives that look like them, right? Because in many ways, they're not necessarily always the target of that candidate's campaign, because that candidate can't necessarily, right, target only Asian American voters and win elected office. And so in that way, it's really hard for us to know, if Asian Americans aren't necessarily supporting an Asian American candidate, like Andrew Yang or some of these other candidates are coming out, is it because descriptive representation doesn't necessarily work for them? I think, on the one hand, of course, we have to think about the diversity, and different Asian groups aren't necessarily represented. One person is not necessarily representative of a very diverse group, which I think is Mark's point. But then at the same time, I think that part of it also is the way that Asian American candidates have to approach themselves to the electorate. And so, I would be interested to see, as we go over time and the Asian American electorate gets bigger, and we do see, and candidates do see them as a powerful bloc that they have to cater to, and they actually change their campaign strategies to actually target Asian American voters, then to what extent descriptive representation really is making a difference, right, for their turnout. But right now, because the messages are so universalistic, they're cross-racial, right, I'm not necessarily sure if what we're seeing right now is a really appropriate reflection of how Asian Americans respond to just a descriptive representative.
It's so interesting. A lot of times when we talk about hyperpartisanship or hear about it in the United States, it usually has a white face to it. And especially in the Trump era, and by this I mean, we read stories about families no longer being able to have like Thanksgiving dinner together because one uncle's a Trump supporter and the niece isn't, and the arguments that are happening and how hyperpartisanship is sort of ripping families apart. And I sort of understand that framing of it, that hyperpartisanship seems mostly like a white phenomenon, because what we've been talking about is how lopsided voters of color support is for the Democratic Party, Democratic candidates. But hyperpartisanship cannot only be something that influences the white electorate. I mean, certainly there are implications for how it's playing out among voters of color. So I'm curious how, as the parties have moved further apart, what that means for either Republican voters of color, and whether or not the same ostracization or demonization that we're seeing, between white voters is happening in our communities in the same way, or if it's sort of confirmation of why voters of color vote the way they do. And I don't know if I'm asking this in the right way, but I'm curious about your insights on how hyperpartisanship sort of screws with group solidarity or group voting behavior, and how that differs from the larger the primary conversation we see around how it's influencing white voters. And this is another one open to the floor, whoever wants to jump in here.
So it's a great question, Ted, and it's a great question because of what we've been seeing within among Latino voters over the course of the last 2 decades. And there really has been an emerging gap in the last 10 years, particularly during the Trump years, between Latinos who say they're Democrats and Latinos who say they're Republicans on a number of policy issues. In fact, it's so interesting to see some of the same divisions that you see for the general public, maybe not quite as sharp. For example, Latino Republicans may not be quite as much in one point of view as, say, Republicans generally, but they're definitely in that direction and different from Latino Democrats on a number of issues, everything from the minimum wage to healthcare to gun rights to immigration. So I do think that there is something there. Now, I haven't been able to measure this, but one of the things that I've heard as I've traveled the country, and actually last year, even in the middle of the pandemic, I went around the country just to kind of hear what folks were talking about and see what was happening. But it was interesting that many Hispanic men would say that they've kind of been ostracized in their families because this is particularly third generation Mexican American men, because of their strong Republican points of view and support for Trump. So it is, I think, a phenomena that is happening within Latino families as well. Maybe not everywhere, but certainly there is some evidence for it. And it is notable that we do see a growing divide between Hispanics who are Democrats, Hispanic who are Republicans. They don't always agree on every issue, just like the general public.
Right.
So I'm going to put my cards on the table and say that in the polarization fight, sort of in the debate that we may have in political science, I'm strongly on the side of explaining polarization as a result of ideological sorting. I think that sort of explains a lot of what's going on. And so what we've seen happen over time is that the center has kind of disappeared in American society. And in particular, it's disappeared because people who would have once identified as liberal Republicans are now Democrats, and people who would have identified as conservative Democrats are now Republicans. And so since you don't have people who are willing to kind of broker and translate for folks within their party, we've seen the party shift and we've seen elections become less competitive, and there are other factors. I don't want to sort of, explain, but I think ideological sorting says a lot about what's going on. And the interesting thing about looking at race, ethnicity, and politics is that while I can detect ideological sorting, as Marcus suggested, it doesn't happen to the same degree amongst communities of color. In particular, I've looked at this project that I'm working on with Tyson King Meadows, Niambi Carter, and Shayla Nunnally. And while we see that Blacks who self-identify as conservative are more likely to be Republican, we know the data. And so the vast majority of Blacks who identify as conservative are not going to be Republican. And our friend Tasha Philpott has pointed out why this is the case. There is this, there's this impasse there. The Republican Party has a bad brand with respect to race, and it's only gotten worse in the Trump era. And so that creates this divide, this hurdle that's really steep for most Blacks to cross. And for lots of people of color, where you're going to see sort of larger than expected kind of conservative Democratic communities, this is the problem. And so, this is one of the hurdles that the Republican Party is going to have to face, right? As long as people think you're racist because you do racist stuff, right? It's going to be hard for people, even people who would be inclined to support you on some issues, to want to identify with you, because race is still highly predictive of people's life chances. So, when we think about sort of who's the middle or who is the more conservative or more moderate wing of the Democratic Party, yeah, right now, Joe Manchin is getting a lot of attention. Totally understand why. On the other hand, though, in terms of voters, that sort of median voter, right, who would be the one who helps Democrats win elections, nationally speaking, is likely a woman of color. And so it's really important for us to keep that in mind. And so whether they're there because they're socially conservative or whether they're there because they're pragmatic, is something that we're going to spend years trying to parse out. But it's important for us to realize that the people who are still moderate within the Democratic Party are more likely to be people of color, and they don't want to be Republicans because, right, the sort of policies that are being put forward by the Republican Party and the posture that the party has taken are either outright hostile towards African American interests, whether those are racial interests or whether those are economic interests.
I mean, to add detail on to Andra, I think, this is the challenge with partisanship for communities of color, which is that, I think the way that race has played a role in how parties have put, stakes into the ground, it's really, it's placed a severe constraint, right? I think that on communities of color, I think that the idea here is that, Blacks aren't democratic because they're uniform, as Andra said, they're not uniform, don't all have uniform attitudes and opinions about politics. They vote Democratic because of the constraints of the ways in which race has played out in terms of party polarization, right? And this, in some ways, is what we're seeing for Asian American Latino voters, that the more and more that race plays this polarizing role, looking specifically at white interests, then you don't necessarily, vote Asian American and Latino voters, while they might hold opinions that we would say classically are Republican or more conservative, they don't necessarily see that as a choice, and so I think it's interesting about this hyperpolarization, because for whites, there really is this privilege, right, of being able to choose between a Democrat and Republican, and for the Democrats and Republicans to truly match or map on to your ideological or political preferences. I mean, that is a privilege in and of itself, right, to be able to have that choice, be a swing voter, flip your vote. If the candidate of one party doesn't cater to your interests, and you can flip yourself and go Democratic. This is the constraint for voters of color, is that they don't necessarily have that choice, right? That if the Republican Party continues to use race baiting and to prioritize specific types of white interests, right, then regardless of your ideological positions, it's not really perceived as a realistic choice.
Yeah, so we're down to about 5 minutes. So I want to give each of you sort of a last question and then sort of a final word. And it's looking forward, given everything we've talked about this evening, everything we saw in 2020, what does that mean for 2022 and especially 2024? And we're not even, are we 100 days into Biden yet? And we're already talking about, like, I think I've seen polls on who the favorites are for 2024. But what are the lessons we've picked up from the last year, 2 years, that can help us be smarter about what we could expect to see in the 22 midterms and the 24 presidential election? I'll start with you, Andra, Natalie, and then I'll give you the last word, Mark.
So, I think earlier you kind of posed the question, what would the Republican Party need to do in order to reach out to voters of color? And, the short kind of simplistic answer is own, acknowledge, and repent of the racist practices that have defined the party for the last 50 years. But what I mean by that specifically is one, you got to acknowledge systemic racism. And there is a huge sort of like gap in terms of sort of how people identify systemic racism, with Republicans being loath to identify that. The second thing is stop pretending that only people of color play identity politics, because that is clearly not true. And understand that group identity matters. And that sort of fits the systemic line. So, Blacks have owned this. Black political scientists who study Black politics have, really sort of embraced this idea that Blacks think about the group when making political decisions, as opposed to their own individual interests. We need to sort of acknowledge that, like, whites operate functionally as a group too, and they operate within that interest. And sometimes those go against the interests of other people, often to their detriment, because they're in more vulnerable positions. So, that would be the thing that I would strongly encourage people to do. And the other thing I would say is, understand that ideological sorting just doesn't work the same way. And if you don't deal with the race problem first, you're still going to be scrambling to try to get 10 to 15 to maybe 20% of Black voters in particular going forward. And so you're not going to get anywhere with that plan. And that might not work to your benefit. So you might get away with that this decade, but you might not get away with that in the next decade or beyond.
Yeah. Natalie.
When I talk about, especially when we're talking about the context of Asian American voters, it's for me, it's less about attitudes or partisanship, but more about turnout. And I think, some of the things that we've learned from 2020 in relation to turnout is that, especially, as you mentioned in the beginning of the talk, COVID policies that integrated mail-in ballots, right? So, and different types of ways to offer access to the ballot box is in many ways attributed to the growing turnout rates, right, for Asian American voters. And so for me, I'm very fearful of the attack on voting rights in this country. I think, ever since the Voting Rights Act was effectively gutted by the 2013 decision, we have worried about the impact on it. And I think what we saw of that Supreme Court decision and what we saw from 2020 is what happens when localities are offered the opportunity, right, to make their own decisions in terms of voting access for their electorates, but specifically thinking about communities of color. And so I think, looking forward, we have to be vigilant about protecting the right to vote, take seriously, right, these efforts that are currently being made. We're also we're coming out of a census year, right, in which now we're redistricting, right? So all of these various different practices in place about thinking about districts, thinking about access to the ballot, and ensuring that voters of color can cast their ballot, that it will have an impact on the election, I think are really critical to making sure that we can maintain the momentum that I think we're seeing in the electorate, where we're seeing, right, this wave of voters of color really having a more powerful say in American elections.
Yeah. Mark.
To echo Natalie, a lot of what we learned in 2020 is when you make it possible for people to vote in different ways, you might have an impact on voter turnout. And that was important in many ways for Latino voters as well. So seeing what sort of momentum we have from 2018 and 2020 and what that will mean for 2022 and 2024 with a Latino electorate that is going to grow by at least 2 million by 2022 and 4 million by 2024, it will be interesting to see whether or not this momentum of voter participation and the lessons learned about how you can make it possible for people to vote in many different ways, whether or not that momentum continues and has an impact on Latino voters. So let's see what happens. But I'm looking forward to these next couple of elections, because I think there's going to be a lot of interesting patterns and data and so forth to look at. And I know I'm a nerd, can't help myself. But I'm looking forward to seeing what transpires. It'll be an exciting time.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. Thank you to Andra Gillespie and Natalie Masuoka and Mark Hugo Lopez for this great conversation. The book is A Return to Normalcy, the 2020 election that almost broke America. And it is available on the UVA website or wherever you buy your books. So thanks to the UVA Center for Politics for hosting this conversation. And thanks to each of you for being in conversation with me tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.